My name is Lorraine Mitchell. I am 56 years old, and I never imagined my daughter's wedding day would end with me standing in my home office, staring at a notary spreading property documents across my desk while my new son-in-law held my house deed in his hands. The champagne was still flowing in the backyard. Guests were laughing and dancing under the string lights my late husband had hung in our garden 5 summers ago. And here I was, watching my worst fears materialize in real time. Brett looked up at me with those cold blue eyes, no longer bothering to hide the calculation behind them, and said the words that made my blood freeze. Ruby stood in the doorway with tears streaming down her face, whispering words that shattered my heart into 1,000 pieces. Before we dive deeper into this nightmare, I want to know where you are watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. If this story resonates with you, or if you have ever felt that gut instinct that something was terribly wrong, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because you need to hear how this unfolds, and trust me, what happens next will leave you absolutely stunned. Now, let me take you back to where this catastrophe truly began. 6 months before that devastating wedding day, my life looked completely different. I was a widow, yes, but I had built a peaceful existence in the 3 years since losing my husband Gerald to a sudden heart attack. Our Victorian house in Portland, Oregon, was more than just property. It was every memory we had created together over 32 years of marriage. The creaky third step on the staircase where Gerald always stumbled, the kitchen window he had replaced after I accidentally broke it with a serving platter, the garden where he had spent every Saturday morning pruning roses and talking to the bees like they were his personal friends. The house was worth $1.2 million according to the latest assessment, fully paid off, sitting in one of Portland's most desirable neighborhoods, where historic homes lined streets shaded by ancient oak trees. Gerald had left me comfortable with the house, savings of $300,000, and his life insurance policy that provided a cushion I hoped would last through my retirement years. My daughter Ruby was 28 years old, a kindergarten teacher with a heart too big for her own good, and a tendency to see the absolute best in everyone she met. She had been single for nearly 2 years after a painful breakup with a man who had cheated on her with her former best friend, and I watched her confidence crumble during those lonely months. She threw herself into her work, spending extra hours decorating her classroom and creating elaborate lesson plans, but I saw the sadness in her eyes every time she came home for Sunday dinner. When she met Brett Caldwell at a charity fundraiser for the local children's hospital, I saw the light return to her face, and I wanted so desperately to be happy for her. Brett was 34 years old, tall and handsome in that polished way that comes from expensive haircuts and tailored suits. He drove a BMW that gleamed like a mirror, wore a watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist, and introduced himself as a real estate investor with properties throughout the Pacific Northwest. The first time Ruby brought him home for dinner, I tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that settled in my stomach like a stone. Brett asked so many questions about the house, walking through rooms with an appraising eye that felt more professional than personal. He wanted to know when it was built, what renovations we had done, whether the foundation had ever needed work, if the roof was original or replaced. I told myself he was just making conversation, that real estate investors naturally noticed these details, but something in his tone felt wrong. Gerald used to say I had a sixth sense about people, that I could smell a con artist from 3 blocks away, and every instinct I possessed was screaming warnings I desperately wanted to ignore. Ruby fell for Brett with a speed that terrified me. Within 2 months of their first date, he proposed with a 2-carat diamond ring that probably cost more than she made in 3 months of teaching. She called me sobbing with happiness, and I forced enthusiasm into my voice while my heart clenched with anxiety. When I gently suggested they wait a bit longer, maybe live together first to make sure they were compatible, Ruby accused me of being unable to let go, of being the kind of mother who wanted to keep her daughter trapped in childhood forever. Brett was there in the background during that phone call. I could hear his voice murmuring supportive words, validating her anger at my concerns, driving a wedge between us with surgical precision. The engagement party happened at my house because Brett suggested it would be more intimate than renting a venue, and Ruby loved the idea of celebrating where she grew up. I watched Brett walk through every room that night, taking photos with his phone, claiming he wanted to capture the memories but lingering too long on architectural details. snapping pictures of closets and storage spaces and the attic entrance. My sister Patricia grabbed my arm in the kitchen and whispered urgently that Brett looked at my house the way a hungry wolf looks at a lamb, and I knew she was right. But what could I do? Ruby was 28 years old, legally an adult, madly in love, and convinced I was jealous of her happiness. Brett's manipulation was so smooth I almost admired the craftsmanship. He never pushed too hard, never showed his true face in public, always played the devoted fiancé who just wanted Ruby to be happy. But I noticed small things, the way he steered conversations toward inheritance and family assets, how he asked Ruby within my hearing about what she would inherit someday, his casual mentions of how adult children deserved financial support from their parents. He planted seeds everywhere, watching to see which ones would grow, cultivating Ruby's sense of entitlement to my property while maintaining his mask of charm. My late husband's mother had been taken in by a con artist years ago, losing $50,000 before the family discovered the truth. And I recognized the same patterns in Brett's behavior. I just could not prove anything yet. And without proof, I was just the overprotective mother standing in the way of true love. Part 3. The Wedding Pressure. 2 months before the wedding, Brett made his first major move. He suggested to Ruby that they should have the ceremony at my house, spinning it as a romantic idea that would save money on an expensive venue and make the day more meaningful by connecting it to her childhood home. Ruby came to me with shining eyes, asking if we could transform the backyard into a wedding venue. And how could I possibly say no? I agreed, despite every alarm bell ringing in my head. And Brett immediately volunteered to help with all the paperwork, permits, insurance requirements, anything that needed an official signature. He showed up 3 days later with a folder full of documents, explaining that we needed liability insurance for the event, that it was standard procedure for hosting large gatherings on private property. I was about to sign when my friend Dorothy dropped by unexpectedly. Dorothy Brennan was a retired attorney who had handled Gerald's estate, and she had a habit of reading everything before anyone signed anything. She picked up Brett's documents with casual interest, then her expression changed, hardening into something sharp and dangerous. "These were not standard event insurance forms," she told me quietly while Brett waited in the other room. Hidden in the dense legal language were clauses about property access rights, about granting temporary residency status to the wedding party, about liability transfers that made no sense for a simple garden ceremony. Dorothy's exact words were that these documents looked like the opening moves in a property seizure scheme, and she had seen similar tactics used by real estate scammers who targeted elderly homeowners. I was only 56, hardly elderly, but the pattern was unmistakable. I refused to sign, and Brett's mask slipped for just a moment. His smile remained fixed, but his eyes went cold, dead, calculating. He said he was hurt that I did not trust him, that he was only trying to help, that this was what family did for each other. When Ruby came home that evening, she was already primed with his version of events, already convinced that I was sabotaging her wedding out of spite. She accused me of hiring Dorothy to find problems where none existed, of being unable to accept that someone could genuinely love her. The argument escalated until Ruby was screaming that she was moving in with Brett immediately, that she could not stay in a house where her mother was actively trying to destroy her happiness. She packed 3 suitcases that night and left, and for 2 weeks she would not take my calls. 1 month before the wedding, Brett's mother Karen arrived from Sacramento, and I immediately understood where Brett had learned his craft. Karen was 62 years old with sharp features and sharper eyes, dressed in designer clothes that probably came from consignment shops, radiating an aura of barely concealed greed. She looked at my house the way an appraiser examines jewelry, calculating value with every glance. During our first and only lunch together, Karen told me with stunning directness that her son deserved a wife who came with security, that Ruby was lucky Brett had chosen her despite her lack of substantial assets. The implication was clear. Ruby's value was in what she could access, and what she could access was me. I hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb because I needed to know exactly who my daughter was marrying. Marcus was thorough, discreet, and horrifyingly effective. Within a week, he delivered a file that made my hands shake. Brett Caldwell was not a successful real estate investor. He was $60,000 in debt, behind on his car lease, 3 months late on his luxury apartment rent, living entirely on credit cards that were nearly maxed out. His supposed properties were lies, his business was non-existent, and his entire persona was a carefully constructed fiction. More disturbing were the relationship patterns Marcus uncovered. Brett had been engaged twice before, both times to women with wealthy mothers, both engagements ending abruptly when the women discovered his schemes. One ex-fiancée had filed a restraining order and accused him of financial manipulation. Another had paid him $20,000 just to make him go away quietly. I showed the evidence to Ruby, laying out the documents on her old bedroom dresser, explaining everything Marcus had found. Ruby looked at the papers like they were written in a foreign language, shaking her head slowly, then faster. Then she was yelling that I had crossed an unforgivable line. She said I had hired someone to spy on the man she loved, that I had invaded his privacy, violated his trust, proven that I cared more about being right than about her happiness. Brett's version of his past was already in her head, carefully planted excuses for everything Marcus had discovered. The debts were from business investments that had not paid off yet. The ex-fiancées were crazy women who had become obsessed with him. The restraining order was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Ruby chose to believe his lies over my documented truth, and she told me that if I did not stop interfering, she would never speak to me again after the wedding. 2 weeks before the ceremony, I made one last desperate attempt to stop the disaster. I tried to cancel the permits for using my property as a wedding venue, thinking that if I could not stop the marriage, I could at least keep it away from my house. Brett's lawyer sent a letter within 48 hours, threatening to sue me for breach of verbal contract, for intentional infliction of emotional distress, for damages to Brett's reputation. The letter used legal language designed to intimidate, and it worked. Ruby delivered her final ultimatum through a text message because she would not even speak to me on the phone. The message said that if I did not allow the wedding to proceed as planned, I would never see her again, that she would cut me out of her life completely, that I would have successfully destroyed our relationship forever. I was trapped between protecting my daughter and keeping my daughter, and I chose wrong. I chose to stay silent and let the wedding happen, praying that somehow Ruby would see the truth before it was too late. During those final 2 weeks, Marcus uncovered even more disturbing information. Brett's best man Derek was actually his cousin, a notary who had been disbarred as a paralegal 3 years earlier for helping clients commit fraud. Derek had 3 fraud convictions on his record, all related to property transfers and forged documents. Karen, Brett's mother, had 2 convictions for welfare fraud. Tyler, Brett's younger brother who was supposed to be an usher, had been arrested for identity theft, though the charges were eventually dropped on a technicality. This was a family of professional con artists, and they had selected Ruby as their entry point to my assets. Marcus told me bluntly that this was a sophisticated operation, that they had probably been planning it for months before Brett ever approached Ruby at that charity fundraiser, that everything from their first meeting to the rushed wedding timeline was calculated strategy. He said I should go to the police, but with what evidence? Brett had not committed any crime yet. He was simply marrying my daughter, and being a con artist with bad intentions was not illegal until you actually executed the con. The morning of Ruby's wedding arrived with gray skies that matched my mood perfectly, clouds hanging low and heavy like a physical weight pressing down on Portland. I woke at 5 in the morning after sleeping maybe 2 hours, my mind racing through scenarios, imagining a dozen different ways I could stop this ceremony, knowing I would do none of them because Ruby had made her choice clear. My daughter arrived at the house at 7 to get ready, barely acknowledging me, speaking only when absolutely necessary, treating me like hired help in my own home. Her coldness hurt worse than any argument would have. This distance between us, a canyon that Brett had excavated over 6 months with precision and patience. Brett's family began arriving by 9 in the morning, invading my space with the confidence of people who already considered it theirs. Karen walked through the house touching furniture, making comments about how they would redecorate once this became Ruby and Brett's home. Tyler was caught coming out of my bedroom, claiming he was looking for the bathroom despite there being 3 other bathrooms on the first floor he had already passed. I noticed immediately that my jewelry box had been moved. Nothing was missing, but someone had clearly gone through it, cataloging contents for future reference. Karen found me in the kitchen, and made a pointed comment about the house being lovely, asking with false casualness whether Ruby would inherit it someday, or if I had other plans. Her eyes were calculating, measuring, already spending money that was not hers and never would be if I had anything to say about it. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon. 75 guests packed into my backyard garden, where Gerald had planted every flower and shrub with his own hands. The weather held, clouds parting just enough to let thin sunshine through, and I stood at the back watching everything unfold with a sense of surreal horror. The minister was a friend of Brett's, a detail I had not known until that morning. Not the pastor Ruby had grown up with, but a stranger who performed the ceremony with unseemly haste. Brett stood at the makeshift altar, smirking through his vows, and I swear I saw him glance at the house more often than he looked at Ruby's face. Ruby looked absolutely beautiful in her grandmother's vintage lace dress that I had saved for 28 years, but her smile seemed fragile, like it might crack at any moment. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the marriage, I felt my mouth opening, felt words forming in my throat, felt the weight of my responsibility to speak crushing down on me. But Ruby's eyes met mine across the crowd, and they were pleading, begging me to stay silent, and I loved her too much to humiliate her publicly. The moment passed. The marriage was declared official at exactly 3:45 in the afternoon. I had failed to protect my daughter. The reception began with champagne toasts and music from a DJ who played too loud, and I moved through the crowd like a ghost at my own funeral. Brett was unusually attentive toward me, bringing me cake, asking if I needed anything, calling me Mom in a way that made my skin crawl. He kept checking his watch, exchanging meaningful glances with Derek across the lawn, and I realized they were counting down to something. At 4:30, Brett and Derek disappeared from the reception. Ruby was surrounded by bridesmaids taking photos, laughing at something one of them said, not noticing her new husband had vanished. My instincts screamed warnings. And this time I listened. I walked away from the party, away from the laughter and music, back toward my house. I found them in my home office, and the scene was even worse than I had imagined. Brett had my file cabinet open, my property deed in his hands, studying it with intense focus. Derek had his notary stamp sitting on my desk. Spread around him were official-looking documents with blank signature lines waiting to be filled. I saw a quitclaim deed that would transfer ownership of my house, a power of attorney that would give Brett control over all my financial decisions, documents creating a family trust with Brett listed as primary trustee. Every piece of paper was designed to strip away my ownership and hand everything to him, all worded carefully to sound like I was protecting Ruby's inheritance while actually giving Brett complete control. Derek looked up when I entered, not even bothering to appear ashamed, just slightly annoyed at the interruption. Brett's words were smooth as oil and twice as slippery. He said I had perfect timing, that they needed my signature on a few routine documents, just formalities to ensure Ruby's future security. He used words like protection and family planning and asset management, making it sound responsible and loving instead of the theft it actually was. The con was brilliant in its construction. Papers that would sound protective to someone who did not read carefully, that would transfer everything while claiming to preserve it. Derek was ready to notarize immediately, making the transfer official and incredibly difficult to reverse once completed. Brett's threat came wrapped in concern. He told me that Ruby believed I was signing over the house as a wedding gift, that she was expecting this generous gesture from her loving mother, that disappointing her on her wedding day would damage our relationship beyond repair. He was weaponizing my love for Ruby, using it as leverage to rob me blind. I refused. My hands were shaking so badly I had to clasp them together, but my voice was steady when I told him I would not sign anything. Brett's mask finally dropped completely, that charming smile disappearing like it had never existed. He called me a stupid old woman, told me with brutal honesty that he never loved Ruby, that he had researched me long before approaching her, that she was worth nothing to him except as a key to unlock my assets. He said the house was worth more than 10 years of Ruby's pathetic teacher salary, that she was just a means to an end, that everything from their first conversation to this moment had been calculated manipulation. Derek chimed in, telling me to make this easy, to just sign the papers, claiming Ruby already believed I was gifting the house anyway. That was when I heard the sound that broke my heart, a small gasp from the doorway. Ruby was standing there, still in her wedding dress, face drained of color, finally hearing the truth she had refused to believe from me. Ruby's voice was tiny, broken, asking Brett if he really meant what he just said, asking if he had used her, asking if any of it had been real. Brett tried immediately to pivot, to claim I was twisting his words, to turn on the charm and save his con. He called her baby and reached for her hands, tried to explain this away as a misunderstanding between family members having a financial discussion. But Ruby had heard too much, seen too much. The documents spread across the desk and the notary, and the cold calculation in Brett's eyes told the truth louder than any explanation could cover. She looked at me with devastation in her eyes, then looked at Brett, then seemed to crumble against the doorframe, her wedding dress pooling around her like a white flag of surrender. The words she whispered shattered everything. She said she was sorry, that she should have listened, that he had told her he loved her and she had believed him because she wanted so desperately to be loved. Ruby collapsed against the doorframe, her body folding in on itself as if the weight of realization was physically crushing her, and the sound she made was something between a sob and a gasp, the noise of someone's world ending in real time. Brett switched tactics instantly, abandoning his aggressive stance toward me and transforming back into the concerned husband, moving toward Ruby with his hands outstretched and his voice dripping false tenderness. He told her that her mother was ruining everything, that I had always tried to come between them, that this was just another example of my controlling behavior. Derek began gathering up the documents, trying to slide them back into his briefcase, attempting to erase the evidence of what I had interrupted. I stepped in front of the office door, blocking his exit, telling him in a voice I barely recognized as my own that he was not leaving with any of my files. Brett used his height to intimidate me, stepping close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes, using his physical presence as a threat without actually touching me. He said I had already ruined Ruby's previous relationship with my meddling, and now I was destroying her wedding day, that she would never forgive me for this public humiliation. Ruby found her voice from the doorway, weak but audible, telling both of us to stop, begging us to just stop talking. The pleading in her tone broke something inside me. The realization that even now, even after hearing Brett's confession, she was still torn between us, still caught in the web of manipulation he had spent 6 months weaving. Brett pivoted his entire strategy toward Ruby, leaving me behind and focusing all his attention on her. He took her hands gently, ignoring how she flinched at his touch, speaking in that soft, concerned tone he had perfected. He told her that everything he had done was for their future together, for building security for them both, that her mother had always stood between them because she could not let go. He mixed just enough truth into his lies to make them convincing, reminding Ruby that I had hired an investigator, that I had tried to cancel the wedding venue, that I had fought against their relationship from the beginning. The half-truths were more effective than pure lies would have been, taking my genuine concerns and reframing them as evidence of my toxic control. Ruby's confusion was visible on her face, the war between what she had heard and what she wanted to believe playing out in her expressions. Brett delivered an ultimatum disguised as a romantic gesture. He told Ruby to come with him now, to leave this house and her controlling mother behind, to start their life together free from interference. His voice was gentle, but his eyes were hard, and I saw the threat beneath his words, the promise that if Ruby stayed with me, he would make her regret it. Ruby looked at me, then at Brett, then at the papers still visible on my desk, and I watched her try to process too much information at once. She whispered that she needed time to think, that everyone needed to leave the office and give her space to breathe, and her voice had the quality of someone drowning, gulping for air between waves. That was when Brett's family joined the attack, as if they had been waiting for their cue. Karen appeared in the hallway asking what was happening, why the bride was crying, her voice loud enough to draw attention from guests outside. Brett immediately spun the story, telling his mother that I was refusing to give Ruby her rightful inheritance, that I was cutting my own daughter off out of jealousy and spite. Tyler materialized behind Karen, adding fuel to the fire by claiming he had heard me yelling, asking if I was attacking the groom. Suddenly, we were 3 against 2. Brett and his family surrounding me and Ruby, their voices overlapping in accusation. Karen's words were particularly poisonous, saying she had known I would do this, that jealous mothers always destroyed their daughters' happiness, that I could not stand to see Ruby loved by someone else. Guests were beginning to notice the commotion, heads turning toward the house, conversations faltering as people realized something was wrong. Patricia, my sister, pushed through the crowd and came inside, demanding to know what was happening. Brett immediately shifted into public performance mode, his voice reasonable and slightly embarrassed, explaining this as just a family disagreement about finances, the kind of thing all families went through, nothing to worry about. His ability to switch masks so quickly was genuinely frightening, from threatening criminal to concerned son-in-law in the space of a heartbeat. Ruby made a decision in that moment of chaos, announcing that she was going upstairs to her old bedroom, that Brett needed to stay downstairs, that she needed space from everyone. I saw a flash of anger cross Brett's face before he smoothed it away, replaced it with understanding and concern. He said, of course, whatever she needed, that he would give her all the time and space she required. But the moment Ruby's footsteps faded up the stairs, Brett's expression turned venomous, transforming into something ugly and hateful. He leaned close to me, whispering threats about legal rights and community property, about how Ruby was his wife now, and that gave him access to her inheritance. Derek added his own comments about Oregon's favorable laws for spouses, how marriage created financial partnerships that were very difficult to dissolve. I realized with sickening clarity that they had studied the law extensively, that this was not an impulsive con but a carefully planned operation with legal backup strategies. Patricia witnessed everything, heard the threats, saw the transformation in Brett's demeanor. She pulled out her phone and said she was calling the police, but Brett's confidence did not waver. He asked with false innocence what crime she would report, pointed out that a groom and his family being in his mother-in-law's house during the wedding reception was hardly illegal, that we had done nothing prosecutable. He was right, and that was the most terrifying part. Everything he had done so far existed in a gray area of manipulation and attempted fraud. Nothing that would interest the police. Nothing that would result in arrests. As evening descended, the reception fell apart, guests sensing the tension and making excuses to leave early. Ruby remained locked in her childhood bedroom, refusing to come down, not answering when anyone knocked. Brett played the concerned husband, standing outside her door and speaking sweetly, telling her he loved her, asking her to please come out and talk to him. His performance was perfect, and guests who were leaving patted his shoulder sympathetically, telling him all marriages had rocky moments, that Ruby would calm down soon. Brett's family refused to leave, planting themselves in my living room like an occupying force. Karen made herself at home in my kitchen, opening cabinets and commenting on how they would redecorate once Ruby inherited. Tyler browsed through family photo albums on the bookshelf, saying these would need to go, that Ruby deserved a fresh start without constant reminders of her past. By 8 in the evening, most guests had finally left. The caterers had cleaned up and departed, and I was left with an invaded house and a daughter hiding upstairs from her new husband. Patricia stayed for support, refusing to leave me alone with Brett's family, and I had never been more grateful for my sister's stubborn loyalty. The house that had been my sanctuary for 30 years felt hostile now, occupied by enemies who were already planning how to carve it up between them. I had never felt so helpless, watching vultures circle while being unable to protect what I had built with Gerald, unable to protect our daughter from the worst mistake of her life. Number. Part 6, The Second Attack, Night of Manipulation. At 10 in the evening, Brett's family was still occupying my living room like they owned the place, sprawling across my furniture with the casual entitlement of conquerors surveying their new territory. Karen had raided my refrigerator and made herself a sandwich, leaving the counter covered in crumbs and an open jar of mayonnaise, commenting loudly about how she would update the kitchen with modern appliances once this became Ruby's house. Tyler was going through my bookshelves, pulling out photo albums and flipping through pages of Ruby's childhood, saying these memories were outdated baggage that would need to be cleared out to make room for Ruby's future. My exhaustion was overwhelming, a bone-deep fatigue that came from emotional devastation rather than physical exertion, but I could not force them out because technically they were wedding guests, and calling the police would only make me look like the villain in Ruby's eyes. Patricia stayed beside me on the love seat, her presence the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. She kept whispering that we needed a plan, that we could not let these people spend the night, but I had no idea how to make them leave without causing a scene that would push Ruby further into Brett's arms. At 10:30, I heard footsteps on the stairs, and Ruby finally emerged from her bedroom. She looked destroyed, her wedding makeup smeared across her face in dark streaks, her eyes swollen from crying, still wearing that beautiful vintage dress that now looked like a costume from a tragedy. Brett immediately rushed to her side, his transformation back into the loving husband so smooth it was like watching a professional actor slip into character. I stood outside Ruby's bedroom door as they talked inside, pressing my ear against the wood and hating myself for eavesdropping but needing to know what poison Brett was pouring into her ears. His voice was gentle, concerned, asking her to think about their future together, about building security. Ruby's response was weak, asking him about the conversation she had overheard, about him talking about taking my house. Brett's spin was masterful, reframing his own words as concern for Ruby's inheritance, saying that as her only child, this house should eventually be hers, that he was only trying to secure what she deserved. He played the long game, pointing out that I would not live forever, asking if Ruby wanted to wait until she was 50 years old to receive her rightful inheritance. Ruby's resistance was fading. I could hear it in her voice. The way her questions became less sharp and more uncertain. Brett continued his manipulation, mixing fake emotion with calculated strategy. He told Ruby that he had been frustrated during our confrontation because I had investigated him, insulted him, treated him like a criminal when all he wanted was to be part of the family. He twisted every legitimate concern I had raised into evidence of my unreasonable behavior, making himself the victim of my cruelty. Ruby asked the question I knew she had been desperate to ask since their first date, the question that made her so vulnerable to his lies. She asked if he really loved her. Brett's answer was practiced perfection, telling her he loved her more than anything, pointing out that he had married her despite all my interference, that he was still here, fighting for their relationship when he could have walked away. The lie was so smooth, so convincing, that I almost believed it myself for a moment. At midnight, Ruby and Brett emerged from the bedroom together, and Ruby made an announcement that filled me with both relief and dread. She said they were going to a hotel for the night, that everyone needed space to calm down and think clearly. I was relieved they were leaving, but terrified about what Brett would say to Ruby once he had her alone, away from my influence, trapped in a hotel room with nowhere to escape his manipulation. Brett's parting words to me were carefully chosen for maximum impact, delivered with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He said we would talk tomorrow, calmly, about Ruby's future, and the way he emphasized future instead of our future told me everything about his true priorities. Karen made her own comment as they prepared to leave, telling me to sleep well in my big house, to enjoy it while I still could. The threat was clear and undisguised, a promise that they would take everything eventually. Tyler was the last to leave, and as he passed through the foyer, he deliberately bumped into an antique vase that had belonged to Gerald's grandmother, a piece of family history that had survived 3 generations. It shattered against the hardwood floor, porcelain fragments scattering everywhere, and Tyler's apology was theatrical and insincere. He said he would replace it eventually, the word eventually stretching out like a taunt, and I knew the destruction was intentional, a demonstration of power, a preview of how they would treat everything I valued. After they finally left at 12:30 in the morning, Patricia helped me clean up the wreckage of the reception and the shattered vase, but the real damage was not visible in the physical debris. I broke down completely, collapsing onto the kitchen floor surrounded by broken porcelain, telling Patricia that I had lost Ruby, that Brett had won. Patricia pulled me up and held me while I sobbed, telling me that Ruby had heard the truth, that she just needed time to process it, that the seeds of doubt had been planted and would eventually grow. We discovered more evidence of their invasion as we cleaned, more items that had been disturbed throughout the house. My study had been gone through, files reorganized, and I noticed immediately that some documents were missing, specifically older property tax records that would have shown the house's appreciation in value. In my bedroom, I found that my jewelry had been photographed. I could see the faint marks on my dresser where a phone had been propped up to take pictures of everything, cataloging my valuables like items in an estate sale. Patricia pointed out that they had been conducting reconnaissance, inventorying my assets, preparing for a comprehensive theft. I checked my safe where I kept the house deed and important papers, and while everything was still there, I saw fresh scratch marks around the combination dial, evidence that someone had tried to open it and failed. The realization that they had attempted to access my safe while I was distracted with wedding guests was terrifying, a violation that made me feel unsafe in my own home. At 1 a.m, my phone buzzed with a text from Ruby. The message said she did not know what to believe anymore, and I could almost hear Brett's voice in the background coaching her words. I responded immediately, telling her I loved her. That love was the only truth that mattered. Ruby's next message crushed me, saying that Brett told her I would try to turn her against him, that I would use manipulation tactics to destroy their marriage. I tried to reason with her through text, reminding her of what she had heard Brett say about the house, telling her that his own words had revealed his true nature. Ruby's response had been clearly dictated by Brett. She said I had misunderstood, that he had explained everything, that he was only trying to help her receive what was rightfully hers. The brainwashing was evident in every word, Ruby repeating Brett's phrases verbatim, her own voice lost beneath his influence. The text conversation continued past 2 a.m, each message from Ruby sounding less like my daughter and more like Brett's puppet. She told me he was her husband now, that she had to trust him, that marriage meant choosing your spouse over your parents. I wanted to scream that marriage should not require cutting off your mother, that love should not demand isolation from family, but I knew anything I said would be twisted by Brett into more evidence of my controlling nature. The manipulation was suffocating, watching my daughter slip away one text message at a time, seeing Brett's influence grow stronger with each passing hour. At 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and started researching Oregon property laws, desperately looking for ways to protect my house from Brett's schemes. I discovered that spouses did not automatically inherit parents' property, which gave me some relief, but I also learned that if Ruby were to inherit as a married woman, Brett would have community property rights to anything she gained during their marriage. The long game became horrifyingly clear. Brett was planning either to wait for me to die naturally or to create situations that would force me to transfer property to Ruby. If I ever needed expensive elderly care, if I faced a medical crisis, if anything happened that required liquidating assets, Brett would be there pushing Ruby to claim her inheritance early. His plan had multiple layers, backup strategies depending on which opportunities presented themselves. The mark of a professional con artist who had worked this scheme before. I sent an email to Marcus Webb, marked urgent, asking for everything he had on Brett Caldwell, every detail of his previous cons, any information that could help me protect Ruby. I needed ammunition for the legal battle I knew was coming, evidence so overwhelming that even Ruby could not deny the truth. As I sat at my computer, surrounded by legal documents and investigation files, watching the clock tick past 4 a.m, I made a decision. I would not be a victim. I would not let Brett destroy my daughter and steal everything Gerald and I had built. If Brett wanted a war, I would give him one, and I would use every resource at my disposal to win. Dawn arrived at 5:30 with weak gray light filtering through my curtains, and I found Patricia asleep on my couch, having stayed all night to make sure I was not alone. The sight of her there, loyal and protective, reminded me that I was not fighting this battle by myself. I had allies, resources, knowledge, and most importantly, I had the truth on my side. Brett's greatest weapon was deception, and once that was stripped away, he had nothing. I spent the early morning hours documenting everything that had happened, writing down every threat, every manipulation, every piece of evidence I had witnessed. I took photos of the scratches on my safe, the disturbed files in my study, the shattered vase that Tyler had deliberately destroyed. I was building a case, gathering ammunition, preparing for the counterattack that would save my daughter and protect everything I valued. Monday morning arrived with the harsh clarity that comes after a sleepless night, and at 8 o'clock I was sitting in Dorothy Brennan's law office, surrounded by leather-bound books and framed diplomas that represented 40 years of legal expertise. Dorothy was 62 years old with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, and she listened to my story without interruption, taking notes in precise handwriting. When I finished, she closed her notebook and delivered her assessment with professional detachment. "This was textbook predatory marriage fraud," she said, "a scheme designed to access assets through family connection, and while it was sophisticated, it was not unprecedented." She had seen similar cases 3 times in her career, and all 3 had ended with the predators in prison or bankrupt from legal judgments. Dorothy outlined my legal options with the efficiency of someone who had planned battle strategies in courtrooms for decades. We could pursue annulment on grounds of fraud, argue that Ruby had been deceived about Brett's true intentions and financial status, that the marriage was based on lies so fundamental it should be voided. We could file for property protection, create legal structures that would prevent Brett from accessing my assets, even through Ruby. We needed to act immediately, Dorothy emphasized, because every day that passed gave Brett more opportunities to manipulate Ruby and more legal standing as her spouse. The timeline was critical. The sooner we moved, the better our chances of success. Dorothy's cost estimate was sobering. Legal fees could reach $50,000 if Brett fought the annulment, potentially more if criminal charges were pursued. I told her without hesitation that I would spend every penny I had to protect Ruby, that money meant nothing compared to my daughter's safety and future. Dorothy smiled grimly and said that was exactly the attitude we needed, because Brett would use every legal trick and delay tactic available, and only absolute determination would win this fight. Marcus Webb arrived at 9 with a folder so thick it barely fit in his briefcase, and what he revealed made my blood run cold. Brett William Caldwell had been running marriage cons for at least 6 years, possibly longer. He used the alias William Brett in previous schemes to avoid background checks, catching the same name twice. Marcus had documented 4 previous relationships with wealthy women over 55, all following the same pattern. He would target their daughters, create whirlwind romances, rush to marriage, then begin the process of isolating the daughter and accessing the mother's assets. 2 of his victims had filed restraining orders after escaping his schemes. One had paid him $30,000 in a private settlement just to make him disappear. Another case was still pending, a lawsuit for financial elder abuse that had been settled privately with confidentiality clauses. The financial details were equally damning. Brett had $68,000 in debt across 7 credit cards, all maxed out or near their limits. His luxury car was leased, and he was 3 months behind on payments. His apartment rent was 4 months overdue, the landlord on the verge of eviction. Brett had no legitimate employment for the past 3 years, supporting himself entirely through credit and previous cons. Derek, his cousin and accomplice, was a disbarred paralegal with 3 fraud convictions related to notary abuse. Karen, Brett's mother, had been convicted twice for welfare fraud, once serving 6 months in county jail. Tyler, his brother, had been arrested for identity theft 2 years ago. The charges dropped only because his victim had died before trial. Marcus' assessment was brutal in its honesty. This was not just a con artist but an organized criminal family that specialized in financial fraud. They were more dangerous than I had imagined because they had experience, connections, and a proven track record of successful theft. Marcus warned me that people like this did not give up easily, that exposing them could lead to escalation, that I needed to prepare for them to get aggressive. He suggested security systems, cameras, possibly even a restraining order if their behavior warranted it. The warning should have terrified me, but instead, it made me angry, a cold fury that settled in my chest and hardened into resolve. At 9:30, my phone rang with Ruby's name on the screen, and my heart leaped with hope that she was calling to come home. Instead, her voice sounded rehearsed, unnatural, clearly reading from a script Brett had written for her. She said they needed to meet and talk, that Brett wanted to discuss the future, like adults. I told her I would meet with her anytime, anywhere, but only if it was just the 2 of us without Brett. Ruby's hesitation confirmed what I suspected. Brett was listening to every word, coaching her responses. She said he was her husband, that they were a team now, that whatever they discussed should include both of them. I could hear Brett's voice in the background, too quiet to make out words but clearly directing the conversation. I asked Ruby if she was safe, if she was okay, and the question seemed to surprise her. She asked why I would ask that, and I heard fear beneath the confusion in her voice, a tremor that told me she was not as confident as she was pretending to be. I told her I loved her, that she could come home anytime she wanted, that my door was always open for her, but she needed to come alone without Brett. Ruby hung up abruptly without responding, and I knew Brett had grabbed the phone or signaled her to end the call. The conversation had lasted less than 3 minutes, but it told me everything I needed to know about how much control he already had over her. At 10, an email arrived from an attorney named Gerald Sutherland, known in Portland legal circles as an aggressive attack dog who represented clients with questionable ethics. The email subject line read, "Intent to pursue inheritance rights," and the content was pure legal intimidation. It demanded that I cease all harassment of the newlyweds, claimed Ruby was entitled to immediate financial support from family assets, and threatened a lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress. The email accused me of attempting to destroy Ruby's marriage out of jealousy, of using my wealth to control her life, of emotionally abusing my daughter for years. Every accusation was designed to turn my legitimate concerns into evidence of my supposed cruelty. Dorothy read the email and laughed coldly, calling it standard intimidation with no legal merit, pure bullying designed to scare me into compliance. At noon, Patricia rallied my support system, bringing together 4 women who would form my army in this fight. We gathered in my dining room where so many happy meals had been shared, but today it was a war council. Besides Patricia and Dorothy, there was Helen from next door, a retired teacher who had watched Ruby grow up, and Constance, my friend from church who had been widowed the same year I was. Each woman brought something essential to the battle. Dorothy had legal expertise, Patricia had fierce loyalty and sharp instincts, Helen had been observing Brett's family casing my property, noticing Tyler trying my gate lock yesterday, seeing Karen taking photos of my house from different angles. Constance suggested we install security cameras immediately to document everything, create a record of any harassment or trespassing. We developed an action plan with military precision. First priority was security, cameras, and upgraded locks installed within 48 hours. Second was legal protection, creating an irrevocable living trust that would prevent Brett from accessing the property even through Ruby. Third was evidence gathering, documenting every contact with Brett's family, recording every threat and manipulation. Fourth was Ruby extraction, finding a way to get her away from Brett long enough to think clearly without his influence. These women refused to let me face this alone, and their support gave me strength I had not known I possessed. At 2 in the afternoon, I sat in Dorothy's office signing documents that would protect my property. We created an irrevocable living trust with me as sole trustee and beneficiary, transferring the house into the trust where it would be protected from any claims Brett might make. Ruby was named as successor beneficiary, but only upon my death, and even then the trust stipulated she could not sell the property for 10 years. This structure made it legally impossible for Brett to access the house through marriage to Ruby, cutting off his primary objective completely. Even if something happened to me, even if Ruby inherited, Brett would have no claim and no control. Dorothy warned me not to tell Ruby about the trust yet, not until we knew she was safe from Brett's retaliation, because he might escalate if he learned his scheme had been blocked. At 4, Marcus delivered evidence that made everything click into place with sickening clarity. He had obtained security footage from the charity fundraiser where Brett and Ruby supposedly met by chance. The footage showed Brett arriving early, speaking at length with the event coordinator, specifically asking about attendees and their families. The coordinator, when questioned, remembered Brett asking which guests had single daughters and which of those daughters had wealthy widowed mothers. Ruby had not been a romantic coincidence or love at first sight. She had been selected, researched, targeted with deliberate intention. Brett had known who she was, who I was, and how much my property was worth before he ever introduced himself to her. Their entire relationship was premeditated fraud, and I had video evidence to prove it. Marcus explained this evidence would be crucial for annulment proceedings, proving fraud in the inducement, demonstrating that Ruby had been deceived into marriage by someone who had targeted her with criminal intent. The video was dated and time-stamped, obtained legally from the venue's security system, admissible in court and impossible for Brett to refute. We had caught him, documented his predatory behavior, and now we had the ammunition to free Ruby from this disaster. At 6, my doorbell rang unexpectedly, and I opened it to find a young woman in her late 20s with anxious eyes and trembling hands. She introduced herself as Bethany Cole and said that Brett Caldwell had been engaged to her mother 3 years ago. Bethany's story poured out in a rush, words tumbling over each other in her urgency to tell someone who would understand. Brett had conned her mother out of $80,000 through a fake real estate investment scheme, forged documents, empty promises, and calculated manipulation. Her mother, devastated by the financial loss and the emotional betrayal, had died of a heart attack 6 months after Brett disappeared with her money. Bethany had been tracking him ever since, determined that he would not do to another family what he had done to hers. Bethany brought evidence, a box full of documents, bank statements, emails, even recordings her mother had made after she realized she was being conned. The timeline of Brett's scheme against Bethany's mother was identical to what he was doing to Ruby and me. The same tactics, the same timeline, the same manipulations. Bethany offered to testify, to do whatever it took to stop Brett, and I saw in her eyes the same determination that was driving me. She had lost her mother to this monster, and she wanted justice for a woman who had died thinking she was a fool. We were no longer just a mother fighting for her daughter. We were part of a network of victims and survivors, an army of women united against a predator. Tuesday morning, I woke at 7 to discover all 4 tires on my car had been slashed, deep cuts that left them completely deflated and useless. The security cameras I had ordered would not be installed until this afternoon, so I had no footage of who had done this, but the message was clear. Brett knew I had been to an attorney. He knew I was building a case, and this was his warning to back off. I called the police and filed a report. Officer Ramirez took notes, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. Domestic disputes that had not yet turned violent were low priority, and property damage without witnesses was nearly impossible to prosecute. Patricia arrived within 20 minutes and immediately said Brett was escalating from manipulation to intimidation to outright vandalism, following a pattern that could become dangerous. At 9, I heard a knock on my door and found Ruby standing on my porch, looking exhausted with dark circles under her eyes, wearing yesterday's clothes. My heart leaped with hope that she was leaving Brett, that she had finally seen through his lies. But that hope died when she asked if Brett could come in to apologize. I told her firmly that she was always welcome, but he was not. That my house was my boundary, and I was done pretending to be civil to the man who had tried to rob me. Ruby's tears started immediately, telling me I was making this so hard, that he was her husband and I needed to accept that. Then Brett appeared from behind my hedge where he had been waiting and listening, proving this whole visit was theater designed to make me look unreasonable. Brett's performance was Oscar-worthy, his voice humble and apologetic as he told me he was sorry for his behavior Saturday. That wedding stress had made him act poorly. The apology sounded rehearsed, delivered with just the right amount of contrition, but his eyes were cold and calculating, watching to see if I would fall for this new tactic. He suggested a fresh start, said we should try again for Ruby's sake, and I recognized this as another manipulation, creating a situation where refusing his fake olive branch would make me look like the villain. Ruby's pleading expression broke my heart. She wanted so desperately to believe we could all get along, that her marriage could be saved, that she had not made a catastrophic mistake. Brett suggested taking both of us to lunch, his treat, to clear the air and start over. Ruby's eyes begged me to accept, and I found myself trapped between refusing and pushing her further away, or accepting and walking into whatever trap Brett was setting. I agreed to lunch at Pietro's, a public Italian restaurant where Ruby and I had celebrated birthdays and graduations, a place with emotional significance that Brett had deliberately chosen. I told him noon, public place. Those were my terms. Brett's smile was too satisfied, like he had won something important, and after they left, Patricia immediately warned me this was strategy, that Brett was planning something, and I needed to be prepared. At 11, Dorothy called to advise me to record everything, reminding me that Oregon was a one-party consent state where I could legally record any conversation I was part of. I set up a recording app on my phone, tested it twice to make sure it worked, prepared myself for whatever Brett would try at lunch. Patricia insisted on coming but sitting at a separate table, serving as backup witness in case things went wrong. Marcus Webb also positioned himself undercover at the bar, documenting everything from a distance. I would not face Brett without protection, would not give him any opportunity to twist events without witnesses to contradict his lies. At noon, I walked into Pietro's and found Ruby and Brett already seated at a corner booth, the same booth where Ruby had told me she had been accepted to college 16 years ago. Brett had chosen this specific table deliberately, using my memories as weapons against me. We ordered food and made awkward small talk, Brett deploying charm and humor, playing the reformed man who had learned from his mistakes. Ruby visibly relaxed, wanting to believe this performance, desperate for evidence that her marriage could work. 15 minutes into the meal, Brett pivoted smoothly to his real agenda, asking if I had thought about my future care, about planning for my later years. I told him I was 56, hardly elderly. But Brett persisted with false concern. He talked about being smart and planning ahead, about what would happen if I got sick or injured, about Ruby needing to be prepared to help me. His angle became clear when he suggested Ruby should have power of attorney for medical decisions, framing it as responsible family planning. The suggestion sounded reasonable, until Brett pulled actual documents from his jacket, papers his attorney had supposedly drafted just in case. Ruby's expression showed she believed this was normal, that Brett was being thoughtful and caring. But I saw immediately that the documents were not limited to medical power of attorney. They included financial control, giving Ruby authority over my bank accounts, my property, everything I owned. I refused to even touch the papers, telling Brett I already had estate planning handled by my own attorney. Brett's mask slipped again, asking if I did not trust my own daughter with power of attorney, weaponizing Ruby against me. He made it sound like I was insulting Ruby's competence, questioning her integrity, when really I was protecting both of us from his theft. Ruby looked hurt, asking why I would not want her to be able to help me if something happened, not understanding that helping and having complete financial control were vastly different things. Brett pushed harder, suggesting I add Ruby to my existing documents unless I did not believe she was capable of handling responsibility, gaslighting us both with surgical precision. Ruby's emotions overflowed, years of insecurity and desire for approval erupting in angry tears. She demanded to know why I hated Brett so much, what he had ever done to deserve my hostility. I told her the truth again, reminded her that she had heard him talk about stealing my house, that his own words had revealed his intentions. Brett immediately reframed those words, claiming I had twisted what he said, that he had been discussing Ruby's eventual inheritance in clumsy language that I had deliberately misunderstood. Ruby was crying openly now, saying Brett had explained everything, that I had violated his privacy by investigating him, that I was the one destroying their marriage with my controlling behavior. The investigation had become the crime, my attempts to protect Ruby transformed into evidence of my toxicity. Classic manipulation that turned reality inside out. I reminded Ruby that I had investigated because something was wrong, that my instincts had been correct, that everything I had discovered proved Brett was dangerous. But Ruby was not hearing me. She was hearing Brett's voice echoing in her head, 6 months of manipulation drowning out 6 minutes of truth. Brett played his final card, saying he loved Ruby and had married her and was committed to building a life with her, asking what more proof I needed of his sincerity. Ruby stood abruptly, saying she needed air, that this was a mistake, that she could not do this anymore. She walked out of the restaurant with Brett following, his arm around her shoulders in a gesture of comfort that looked possessive to anyone paying attention. Brett's parting look at me contained pure hatred, no more pretense, no more masks, just raw loathing from a predator whose scheme was being threatened. Patricia joined me at my table after they left, telling me I had done the right thing, that Ruby had heard truth even if she denied it, that seeds of doubt would grow even in poisoned soil. Marcus reported that he had recorded everything, that Brett's body language had shown deception in 12 separate instances that an expert witness could identify in court. But none of that mattered if Ruby would not listen, if she remained trapped under Brett's control, if his influence continued to overpower everything I said. At 2 p.m, Dorothy called with news that made my stomach drop. Brett had filed a restraining order petition against me, claiming I was harassing and stalking the newlyweds, that my behavior had become threatening and obsessive. The petition was full of lies. Accusations that I had showed up at their hotel uninvited, that I had sent threatening messages, that I was making their lives impossible. The court hearing was scheduled for Friday, giving me only 3 days to build a defense against fabricated charges. Brett's strategy was clear now. Isolate Ruby completely from me. Use the legal system to enforce that isolation. Paint me as the aggressor while he played the victim. At 5, Bethany Cole called with news that gave me the first real hope I had felt in days. She had found another victim, a woman named Margaret Sutherland, whose daughter had been engaged to Brett 2 years ago. Margaret was 61, a former attorney, and she had fought back against Brett, gathered evidence, forced him to flee rather than face exposure. She had court documents, recordings, proof of Brett's pattern of predation, and she was willing to testify. Margaret had been tracking Brett too, trying to warn his future victims, and she was grateful to finally connect with someone who could use her evidence. She told Bethany she would not let Brett do to another family what he had tried to do to hers, that she would travel to Portland and stand with me in court if necessary. I was no longer fighting alone. I had an army of women who had survived Brett's schemes, and together we would save Ruby whether she wanted to be saved or not. Wednesday morning began with preparation for Friday's restraining order hearing, Dorothy assembling a defense file so thick it barely fit in her briefcase. The evidence included Brett's criminal history from Marcus' investigation, testimony statements from Bethany about her mother's destruction, and now documents from Margaret Sutherland, who had driven down from Seattle overnight to join our fight. Margaret arrived at my house at 8 in the morning looking like an avenging angel, steel-haired and fierce-eyed, carrying her own thick folder of evidence. She told me her story over coffee while Dorothy took notes, how Brett had engaged to her daughter Lindsay, how his methods were identical to what I was experiencing, how she had recognized the con because her legal background gave her the tools to see through his lies. Margaret's advantage had been her profession. She was a retired attorney who specialized in fraud cases, and she had known within 3 weeks that Brett was running a scheme. She had confronted him with evidence, threatened criminal prosecution, and forced him to break the engagement and leave Seattle. Her regret was palpable as she told me she should have pressed charges, should have put him in prison where he could not hurt others. But at the time she had only wanted him away from her daughter. Now Lindsay was healing in therapy, recovering from the psychological damage of realizing someone had pretended to love her as part of an elaborate theft plan, and Margaret was determined that Brett would face consequences for what he had done to her family and was doing to mine. Dorothy outlined our counter-strategy with the precision of a general planning battle. We would turn Brett's restraining order into his own trial, expose his criminal pattern in court, force him to defend himself against overwhelming evidence. The risk was that this public exposure could push Ruby deeper into Brett's control, make her defensive and more loyal to him, but the alternative was allowing Brett to isolate her completely, with a legal order keeping me away. We decided to go forward with full exposure, betting that truth publicly revealed would eventually break through Brett's manipulation. Margaret agreed this was the right approach, saying public record would also protect other potential victims, that Brett's pattern needed to be documented in court, where future targets could find it. At noon, my neighbor Helen called in a panic, saying Ruby was at my house and she was alone, that I should hurry before Brett came back. I drove the 3 blocks home in record time, my heart pounding, and found Ruby sitting in the garden where she used to play as a child, surrounded by the roses Gerald had planted when she was born. She was wearing sunglasses indoors, which immediately made me suspicious, and when I asked if she was hurt, if Brett had hurt her, she flinched at the question. She said she did not know who to believe anymore, that her world had become so confusing she could not tell truth from lies, reality from manipulation. Ruby's breakdown was devastating to witness. 3 days of marriage to a stranger had stripped away her defenses and left her raw and vulnerable. She told me things that made me want to commit murder, how Brett was different when they were alone, cold and calculating instead of warm and loving. Their wedding night had been spent with Brett on the phone with his mother, discussing strategy for their next moves, treating Ruby like she was not even there. On Monday, Brett had taken Ruby to the bank and tried to open a joint account with my name attached, claiming it was for managing my finances if I became ill, and Ruby had refused for the first time, her instincts finally screaming warnings she could not ignore. Brett's reaction to her refusal had been eerily calm, followed by 6 hours of silent treatment, punishing her with coldness that felt worse than anger would have. Ruby confessed that Tuesday, Brett had started monitoring her phone, questioning every text message, demanding to know who she was talking to and what they were saying. She said she thought marriage was supposed to be like this. That compromise meant giving up privacy and autonomy, that she had been trying to be a good wife by accepting his control. I told her with absolute clarity that compromise was not giving up yourself, that love should not require surrendering freedom, that what Brett was doing was abuse, even if he never raised his hand. Ruby started crying harder, saying she felt so stupid for not listening to me, for ignoring every warning, for believing his lies over my truth. I held my daughter while she sobbed, and I told her she was not stupid, that Brett was a professional liar who had practiced his craft on multiple victims, that intelligence had nothing to do with falling for someone who made deception their art form. Ruby's biggest fear was what people would think. The marriage was only 2 days old and she was already considering leaving, the shame of that failure weighing on her like concrete. I told her that people would think she was brave and strong and smart enough to correct a mistake before it became a disaster, that staying in a bad marriage was infinitely worse than ending one quickly. Ruby seemed to hear me for the first time in months, really hear me without Brett's voice drowning out my words. Then we heard a car in the driveway, and Ruby's panic was immediate and visceral. She said Brett would be so angry she came here, that she had told him she was going to the grocery store, that he tracked her phone location and knew exactly where she was. I told her she was an adult who could visit her mother without needing permission, but Ruby was already shrinking into herself, becoming smaller and more afraid. Brett entered without knocking, his tone light but his eyes furious, telling Ruby he had been worried when she wandered off. He was treating her like a confused child who needed supervision, deliberately diminishing her in front of me, demonstrating his control over her movements and decisions. I told Brett that Ruby had come to visit me and did not need to be found, but he ignored me completely, focused entirely on Ruby. He said they had an appointment. They needed to leave now, and Ruby looked confused because there was no appointment. Brett claimed it was with a financial planner about their future, code words that reminded Ruby of his narrative, that brought back his influence. I told Ruby she could stay for dinner, that Brett could go to his fake appointment alone. But Brett's smile was tight as he said they were married now and did things together. The possessiveness in his voice was chilling, the implication that Ruby no longer had autonomy clear to everyone in the room. Ruby found a moment of courage, telling Brett she wanted to stay for dinner and he should go ahead without her. Brett's shock was visible for just a second. He had not expected her to defy him in front of a witness, and his recovery was not quite fast enough to hide his anger. He said that was fine. He would pick her up at 8, phrasing it as a statement rather than a question, telling rather than asking. Before he left, he kissed Ruby's forehead and whispered something I could not hear, and Ruby flinched at whatever he said. After his car pulled away, Ruby collapsed onto my sofa and said she had 3 hours before she had to go back, using the words had to instead of wanted to, already viewing herself as a prisoner on temporary release. The truth poured out of Ruby over the next 2 hours, everything she had been holding inside for 3 days of hell. Brett controlled her phone, had installed a tracking app without her permission, monitored her location constantly. He had opened credit cards in Ruby's name without asking, saying spouses shared everything, including credit, that there were no secrets in marriage. Ruby had discovered photos on Brett's laptop, pictures of my house labeled as our future investment, accompanied by notes about property value and potential resale profit. She had confronted him, and Brett had said my exact words back to her, that I would not last forever, that the house would eventually be theirs. Ruby's horror at realizing she had married someone who viewed her mother's death as a business opportunity was visible in every trembling word. Ruby also confessed to sexual coercion, Brett pressuring intimacy when she was uncomfortable, telling her this was what marriage meant, that good wives did not refuse their husbands. She had thought this was normal, that her discomfort was her own failing, that she needed to adjust her expectations of what marriage should feel like. I told her with absolute fury that compromise was not giving up bodily autonomy, that marriage was not ownership, that what Brett was doing was assault even within the legal bounds of marriage. Ruby's shame was overwhelming. She had believed his lies about wifely duty, had blamed herself for not wanting to be intimate with someone who terrified her. I asked Ruby if she could really leave, if she was ready to end this disaster of a marriage, and she asked me if she even could after only 2 days. I told her she could leave any second of any day, that marriage was not a prison sentence, that she was not trapped no matter what Brett said. Ruby's practical concerns came tumbling out. Her apartment lease had ended before the wedding. All her belongings were at Brett's place. She had nowhere to go and no way to retrieve her things without facing him. I told her this was her home, always had been, and always would be, that she could live here as long as she needed. Ruby's biggest fear was that Brett would not let her go easily, that he needed this marriage to access my assets, that he would fight to keep her under his control. I promised Ruby we had protection, legal help, evidence, witnesses, an entire network of women ready to help her escape. I told her Dorothy was preparing annulment papers, that Margaret and Bethany were ready to testify about Brett's pattern, that she was not alone in this fight. Ruby said she needed a few days to figure out how to leave safely, and I agreed, but told her she was staying tonight, that she needed to call Brett and tell him she was not coming back. Ruby picked up her phone with shaking hands and dialed, and I watched my daughter reclaim her first piece of autonomy in 3 days. The phone call was short and brutal. Ruby told Brett she was staying at her mother's house tonight, and Brett's voice came through the speaker sharp and angry, telling her that was not acceptable, ordering her to come home immediately. Ruby's voice was stronger than I had heard it in months when she said this was not a discussion, she was staying here, and he needed to accept that. Brett's threat was clear. He said she was making a big mistake, that she should not do this, that she would regret defying him. Ruby told him she needed time to think, and Brett's final words were that she had 1 hour, then he was coming to get her. Ruby hung up, and her hands were trembling. But she had done it. She had set a boundary and enforced it, her first act of rebellion against his control. True to his threat, Brett arrived at 8:30 with Karen and Tyler, and they banged on my door with enough force to rattle the frame. They were aggressive, demanding, shouting for Ruby to come out and stop being childish. I called the police while Brett's family screamed threats from my porch, Karen yelling that Ruby was throwing away her marriage and her future, Tyler adding that I was controlling Ruby and destroying her life. The police took 20 minutes to arrive, 20 minutes of harassment and intimidation, and when officers Ramirez and Chen finally showed up, Brett immediately shifted into victim mode. He told the officers he just wanted to talk to his wife, that her mother was manipulating her and keeping them apart, playing the concerned husband perfectly. Ruby gave her statement to the officers with a strength I had not seen in her since before she met Brett. She told them clearly that she was staying voluntarily, that she did not want to see her husband, that she wanted him and his family removed from the property. The legal reality was simple. Ruby was an adult who could not be forced to go anywhere, and the police escorted Brett's family away from my house. Brett's parting threat was delivered quietly, but with absolute conviction. He told Ruby this was not over, that she was still his wife, that he would not let her go so easily. The promise of future action hung in the air like poison, and I knew this was only the beginning of his retaliation. Ruby slept in her childhood bedroom that night, in the same bed where she had recovered from chicken pox and practiced for school plays and cried over her first heartbreak, and she told me the next morning it was the first peaceful sleep she had experienced in days. I kept watch through the night, afraid Brett would return, and at 3 a.m. his truck drove by my house slowly, deliberately, a threat and a promise. The security system had been installed that afternoon, cameras recording everything, and I had footage of Brett's intimidation that would be useful in court. Ruby woke at dawn and came down to the kitchen where I was making coffee, and she said she had forgotten what it felt like to not be afraid, to sleep without wondering what mood Brett would be in when he woke up, to exist without constant surveillance. Thursday morning, we sat in Dorothy's office while Ruby gave a full statement about her 3-day marriage to a monster. She detailed the financial abuse, the emotional manipulation, the sexual coercion, the control over her phone and movements, everything Brett had done to isolate and dominate her. Dorothy recorded every word, building a case for annulment based on fraud in the inducement, proving Ruby had been deceived about Brett's true nature and intentions. The legal grounds were solid. Brett had married under false pretenses, had lied about his finances and his feelings, had targeted Ruby specifically to access family assets. Dorothy filed the annulment petition that afternoon, scheduled a hearing for 2 weeks out, and immediately filed a restraining order protecting both Ruby and me from Brett's harassment. Ruby's greatest fear was that Brett would fight the annulment, that he would drag this out for months or years, keeping her legally tied to him while he continued his schemes. Dorothy assured her that we had overwhelming evidence. Testimony from Margaret, whose daughter had escaped Brett's previous con. Testimony from Bethany, whose mother had been destroyed by his fraud. Video footage of Brett researching Ruby before their supposed chance meeting, and Ruby's own statement about the abuse she had endured. No judge would force Ruby to remain married to a proven predator. The annulment was all but guaranteed, and within months, Ruby would be legally free. Marcus suggested we contact local media, that an investigative reporter might be interested in a pattern of elder fraud through marriage schemes. That public exposure was the best protection against predators who thrived in shadows. Margaret strongly agreed, saying her only regret was not exposing Brett publicly when she had the chance, that keeping it private had allowed him to move to another city and find new victims. Ruby found courage I did not know she possessed and agreed to tell her story publicly, saying if it helped even one other family recognize the warning signs, then her humiliation would have purpose. We contacted a journalist named Samantha Klein who had been investigating marriage fraud cases for months, and she was eager to interview us after the legal proceedings concluded. Friday arrived with the restraining order hearing, and I walked into the courthouse with Dorothy, Ruby, Margaret, Bethany, and Patricia, an army of women ready to defend against Brett's lies. Brett arrived with his attorney Gerald Sutherland, both of them dressed impeccably, playing their roles of victim and defender. Judge Patricia Morrison, presiding, was a no-nonsense woman of 68 who had seen every courtroom trick in 4 decades on the bench, and I felt hope when I saw her expression of skepticism as Brett took the stand. Brett's testimony was smooth, claiming I had harassed him from the moment Ruby introduced them, that I had hired investigators to stalk him, that I had tried to destroy their wedding and was now attempting to destroy their marriage out of jealousy and control. Dorothy's cross-examination destroyed Brett's credibility with surgical precision, presenting evidence that contradicted every claim he made. She showed footage of Brett researching my property before meeting Ruby, proving his interest was calculated rather than romantic. She presented Margaret Sutherland as a witness, and Margaret testified about the identical pattern Brett had used against her daughter. The same timeline, the same manipulations, the same ultimate goal of accessing family assets. Bethany Cole testified about her mother's financial devastation and death, about Brett's cold calculation in destroying a vulnerable woman. Ruby testified last, describing the 3 days of marriage that had revealed Brett's true nature, the control, the abuse, the threats, and the realization that she had been targeted as a means to an end. Judge Morrison's ruling was swift and uncompromising. She denied Brett's restraining order petition, finding no evidence of harassment from me, only a mother's legitimate attempts to protect her daughter from a predator. She granted our counter-restraining order, forbidding Brett from coming within 100 yards of Ruby or me, making any contact, direct or indirect, or attempting to access my property in any way. Judge Morrison's statement from the bench was damning. She said the court found evidence of a clear pattern of predatory behavior, that Brett Caldwell appeared to be a serial con artist who targeted vulnerable women and their families, and that she was forwarding the case information to the district attorney for potential criminal investigation. Brett's fury was visible as he stormed out of the courtroom, and Karen made a scene about discrimination and injustice before the bailiff escorted their entire family out with warnings about contempt of court. 2 weeks later, the annulment hearing was even more decisive. Ruby's petition was granted based on overwhelming evidence of fraud, the marriage declared void from inception, legally erased as if it had never existed. Brett contested weakly, claiming he loved Ruby and wanted to save their marriage, but Dorothy's cross-examination revealed every lie. When asked directly if he had researched my property value before meeting Ruby, Brett said no, and Dorothy immediately presented his browser history showing dozens of property searches. When asked about the notary and documents at the wedding, Brett claimed it was a misunderstanding, and Dorothy presented Derek's testimony. The cousin had flipped in exchange for lesser charges and confirmed Brett had planned the property theft for months. The judge's ruling freed Ruby completely and additionally ordered Brett to pay all of Ruby's legal fees, adding financial consequences to his failed scheme. The district attorney took interest in the case based on the pattern evidence from multiple victims across state lines. Criminal charges were filed against Brett for fraud, attempted theft by deception, and conspiracy, with Derek facing charges for notary misconduct and fraud. The FBI became involved when they realized Brett's schemes crossed state borders, meeting the threshold for federal wire fraud charges since he had used internet research and digital communication to plan his crimes. Brett's entire world collapsed within a month, his cons exposed, his family facing their own charges for conspiracy, his freedom disappearing as warrant after warrant was issued. He fled Oregon, trying to escape to Arizona, but was arrested 3 weeks later using a different name in a Phoenix hotel, caught trying to run the same scheme on another victim. 1 month after the wedding disaster, Ruby was back teaching kindergarten, surrounded by finger paintings and construction paper crafts, rebuilding her life one day at a time. She started therapy to process the trauma, to understand how manipulation worked, to learn the signs she had missed. She joined a support group for victims of relationship fraud and found community with other women who had been targeted by predators. Ruby began speaking at women's shelters about recognizing warning signs, about trusting instincts, about the fact that intelligence offered no protection against professional liars. Her message resonated with hundreds of women who had similar stories, who had ignored their own warnings because they wanted love to be real. The relationship between Ruby and me became deeper than it had ever been, forged in crisis and strengthened by survival. Ruby apologized for not listening, for choosing Brett's lies over my truth, and I told her she had listened when it mattered most, that she had saved herself by finding the courage to leave after only 3 days. We planted new flowers in the garden together that spring, symbolizing growth after devastation, creating new memories in the space where Gerald's roses still bloomed. Ruby moved back into her childhood home temporarily, while she saved money and healed, and having her there filled the house with life again. 3 months after the wedding, Brett was extradited back to Oregon to face trial. He eventually pleaded guilty to multiple fraud charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years probation. He was ordered to pay restitution to Ruby, to Margaret's family, to Bethany for her mother's losses, financial consequences that would follow him for decades. Karen and Tyler faced their own charges for conspiracy, their participation in Brett's schemes finally bringing legal consequences. The family of con artists that had terrorized multiple women across 2 states was finally held accountable. 6 months after the disaster, my house remained my sanctuary, Gerald's memory still present in every corner, but now protected by security systems and legal structures that made it impossible for predators like Brett to touch. Ruby had moved back in temporarily but was looking for her own apartment, ready to restart her independent life with wisdom earned through suffering. She started dating again, slowly and carefully, with better judgment and clearer boundaries. Our mother-daughter relationship was stronger than it had ever been, built on survived crisis and proven loyalty. We sat on the porch swing together on warm evenings, watching sunset paint the sky orange and pink, and Ruby thanked me for saving her life. I told her she had saved her own life, that I had only held the door open while she found the courage to walk through. The lesson we learned was about community and the power of women supporting women. Patricia, Dorothy, Helen, Constance, Margaret, Bethany, every woman who had stood with us had been essential to our victory. Speaking up had saved not just Ruby but 3 other women who came forward after seeing news coverage, women who were in early stages of similar cons and recognized the pattern in time to escape. Legal protection through the living trust had secured my property, but vigilance and trusting instincts had been equally important. Ruby's wisdom, earned through pain, was simple but profound. She said love should never cost you your freedom, that real love adds to your life instead of subtracting from it, that anyone who isolates you from family is showing you exactly who they are, My own peace came from knowing I had fought every battle necessary to protect my daughter, that I had used every resource available, that I had never given up even when Ruby pushed me away. The house remained in my name within the protective trust. But more importantly, I had protected Ruby herself, saved her from years or decades trapped with a predator. That was the real inheritance I would leave her someday. Not property or money, but the knowledge that her mother had loved her enough to fight for her even when she did not want to be saved. The enduring truth we both learned was that they had won, not just legally, but spiritually. Ruby discovered that her worth was not defined by relationship status. That being alone was infinitely better than being with someone who diminished her. I learned that sometimes protecting loved ones meant letting them stumble, trusting that they would remember your warnings when they needed them most. Together we learned that family was the strongest fortress against predators, that love rooted in truth could survive any manipulation, that women united in purpose were unstoppable. The house remained standing, a symbol of what we had protected, but the real victory was in each other, in trust rebuilt and courage discovered. Ruby was free now, legally and emotionally, no longer tied to a man who had viewed her as a transaction. She was healing, growing stronger, building a life defined by her own choices rather than someone else's control. And I was at peace knowing that when the next crisis came, because life always brought new challenges, Ruby would remember this lesson. She would trust her instincts, listen to warnings, recognize manipulation before it consumed her. That knowledge was worth more than any property, any inheritance, any material possession. We had fought for each other and won, and no con artist could ever steal that truth from us. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a gut feeling about someone that everyone else ignored? Have you or someone you love been targeted by a manipulator who seemed perfect at first? Drop your story in the comments below because your experience might help someone else recognize the warning signs before it is too late. If this story resonated with you, if you felt Ruby's pain or understood my desperation as a mother, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell because I share real stories about real people surviving real crises, and you need to hear what happens when ordinary families face extraordinary challenges. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear it, especially mothers and daughters, because this kind of predatory behavior is more common than anyone wants to admit. Thank you for watching, for listening, for being part of this community of survivors and supporters. Remember that speaking up might feel uncomfortable, but silence allows predators to thrive. Trust your instincts, protect your loved ones, and never apologize for fighting to save someone you love. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and I will see you in the next story.